I want to move to the subject of abolition because we know abolitionism, of course, was supported by black women as well as white women, North and South, but the publicity goes to white women. Can you talk a little bit about the relationships among women, first in the abolitionist movement and then in relationship to the problem of slavery in the South?
Well, I think women in the abolitionist movement as a subject or of inquiry or historical subject is interesting and complicated because on the one hand, white women and black women, African American women in the North are all working for the same goal, the emancipation of black people in the South. And they're also working, some of them at least, for a kind of corresponding goal, which is equality in the North for black people who are already free. And so I think black abolitionists, black women abolitionists are more engaged in sort of this dual task of abolition and the struggle for equality. And white women abolitionists, why some of them cross that fence as well, are more engaged with the abolition of slaves and the abolition of slavery. Their relations, I think, I mean, if you look at female abolition societies or anti-slavery societies, you've got mainly white and then black ones, and sometimes they join together. Sometimes they join on the podiums when they hold anti-slavery meetings. You'll have white women and black women. But there's also a divide, even among the most famous, like the Charlotte Fortin and the Philadelphia group of abolitionists, black and white. So I think that where the tension existed was in the fact that white women abolitionists could see so clearly the need to end slavery, but could not see as clearly as black women abolitionists the corollary fight for equality. And it's like, as white women abolitionists would later say, okay, when the question of suffrage came up, you know, why give black men the vote when women don't have the vote? And so people kind of stack things and they prioritize, right? So for white women abolitionists, it's emancipation. And I remember one of the women that I'm currently studying who was an abolitionist from New York, and she said a white woman abolitionist who wrote to a friend in England, and she said, you know, we are willing to fight for abolition, but we're not willing to fight for equality. And when the war came, she wrote again, and she said, stop pressing us on the equality front. Emancipation, yes, but we don't, I mean, she was like a true Lincolnite. We don't have to have both.
But what did she think emancipation would mean for black women?
Beyond removing them from the absolute control of another human being, or that, and that control, of course, is buttressed by the state, they would be free, and which is, you know, a huge problem for historians still. Like, so what does this mean, freedom? What does it mean that they'll be free? But I don't think most white women abolitionists had in their minds any sort of concrete notion of what freedom would mean beyond what they saw in their own spaces in Philadelphia or Concord or Boston. That black women who were free in those spaces lived a certain kind of life. They lived in certain communities, not always segregated, but increasingly so. They worked in white households, primarily so.
So in the eyes, it sounds as though what you're saying is that in the eyes of white women, even white women abolitionists, freedom for black women meant freedom to work for wages, freedom to work for them as domestic servants, freedom, perhaps to marry or to live lives within their own enclaves, but not freedom to associate with white people.
Right.
Freedom to compete, but on an unequal basis.
On an unequal basis. Freedom to compete in your world, and which actually, of course, became the reality that black people, once freed into the 20th century, were free to compete in their own worlds, to have their own social and civic organizations, but not to compete in the white world.
So for African American enslaved people, can we say what freedom meant to them? What their expectations or aspirations were of freedom?
It's a very good question, a very hard question to answer. I mean, the simplest, most basic answer is that, and the one we hear all the time, that freedom was the opposite of slavery, but that doesn't take us very far, right? It takes us over a sort of legal obstacle that made slavery constitutional and so forth. But what exactly does it mean to be in a position where it's not slavery? And I'm not sure that even white people knew what that meant at that moment, because I think the country in general was still struggling with that. If white people knew, it wouldn't have taken until the 1830s, 20s and 30s for all white men to get the vote, right? So freedom is this constantly and still today evolving notion, but to be, try to be a little bit more concrete in response to your question. Enslaved people entered freedom believing that it meant, in concrete ways, the right to mobility, no more passes, no more asking if you can walk from this farm to the next farm, the right to marry, the right to make contracts, the right to be able to control your children, the right to an education, so fundamental when there were laws in slavery said that black people could not be taught to read and write. The right to pass on whatever you accumulated in life to your heirs. And we know, today how important it's been in this country that for wealth to be passed on and what it's meant in terms of one's ability to lead a certain kind of life. If you were a slave, many slaves had property, so to speak, right? You worked extra, or you made baskets. The proceeds of your labor that you could dispose of, that you could sell, not your body. Your body would not be on the market anymore, but your labor power, in a Marxian sense, would be on the market. And you could sell that labor power and get a wage for it and use that money for your family. And maybe you could save some, and one day you could buy a piece of land. So in slavery, you could work extra and you could make extra money. And in slavery, some people took that extra money and they bought their husband or their wife or their child out of slavery. Some people took it and did things like, buy a pair of earrings for their wife, and some people bought pens or knives and forks. But now, nobody could, as they could during slavery. When you died as a slave, everything that you bought technically belonged to the owner, to the master. And so it does make a difference in all of these ways, and it's because it makes these kinds of changes and it's transformative. That's why we see the backlash, right? That we're not going to allow former slaves to have these things, because if we do, who's going to do the other work, labor?
What's fascinating about this is that when we looked at the early 19th century, we talked about women, all women, or pretty much all married women, not having property in their own labor, that the property in their labor, the ability to sell their labor and to whom to sell it, and the wages of labor went to generally to their husbands, but sometimes to their fathers. And now we're in a situation where formerly enslaved people have acquired property in their own labor, to use the 19th century
It's
language.
an amazing transformation when you think both of the struggles of women and of slaves to gain control of their bodies and not of their reproductive labor and their productive labor, right? And for slave women, this is critical, you know, to have the right to control your reproductive labor as well. And one of the most fascinating things that I'm working through now, many slaveholders talked about enslaved women who were not having enough children, and they accused them of using abortifacients or aborting the children.
Because, of course, those children belonged to the
to
slave
the
owner.
slave owner. But what's so fascinating is during the Civil War, black women are having abortions. Now, this threw me for a loop, but only for a moment, because these are women who are being raped in refugee camps. These are women who are coming in from plantations where they may have been raped by their owner. Confederate and Union soldiers are kind of all throughout the space. And so at first I thought, why now? I mean, why would you abort a child when finally you are about to be free, or you are free, and this child will be free? But then I had to remember the context. And so maybe for the first time, you can take this kind of control, and we shouldn't make it seem as though by taking this kind of control, this woman or these women are throwing their freedom away.